Viking Age Farmers. Tonight, we're traveling back to a time when simply surviving a single day required more strength than most of us will ever need. Get comfortable, close your eyes, and let me tell you about lives so difficult. They'll make your own troubles seem beautifully simple. Welcome to Boring History for Sleep. You are a Viking farmer in the fjords of Norway. In the year 987 AD, the morning mist clings to the valley like a cold shroud, and you wake before the pale northern sun has even considered rising, because winter is coming, and every day of preparation could mean the difference between your family's survival and starvation. Your bed is a simple wooden frame, filled with straw and covered with wool blankets that your wife wove from sheep you raised, slaughtered and processed yourself. The longhouse around you is dim and smoky, heated by a central fire that burns constantly, filling the air with the scent of burning birch wood and the ever-present smell of animals, food, and human habitation. You sleep in the same room as your livestock, because winter temperatures in Norway can kill both humans and animals, and shared body heat means survival for all. The snorting of horses, the lowing of cattle, and the bleating of sheep provide a constant background chorus to your dreams. A reminder that your life and theirs are intertwined in the harsh reality of northern survival. The fjord outside your longhouse is beautiful in the way that dangerous places often are. Steep mountains rising like walls on either side of dark water. Waterfalls cascading hundreds of feet down rock faces, and forests so dense they seem to swallow light itself. But this beauty is unforgiving, offering little flat land for farming, short growing seasons, and weather that can turn deadly without warning. You dress in layers of wool and leather, clothing that has been designed through generations of trial and error to keep Norse bodies alive in conditions that would kill softer peoples. Your boots are lined with fur. Your cloak is woven so tightly it sheds water like a duck's feathers. And every piece of clothing you wear has been made by hand from materials you've produced yourself. The work of a Viking farmer never ends, but it changes with the seasons in patterns that have been followed for thousands of years. Summer is for planting, tending, and growing. Autumn is for harvesting, slaughtering, and preserving. Winter is for surviving, repairing, and planning. Spring is for cleaning, rebuilding, and beginning the cycle again. This morning in late autumn, your most urgent task is preparing meat for the long winter ahead. The cattle you've spent months fattening must be slaughtered before the first hard freeze. Their meat preserved through smoking, salting, and drying techniques that will keep your family fed when snow covers the ground for months and hunting becomes nearly impossible. You walk to the animal pen, your breath visible in the cold air, your feet crunching through frost that coats the grass like tiny crystals. The cattle sense what's coming, moving restlessly in their enclosure, their warm bodies steaming in the morning chill. These animals have been your companions for months, but sentiment is a luxury that Norse farmers cannot afford. The slaughter is quick, efficient, and performed with the respect that Norse culture demands for animals whose death ensures human survival. Use knives that have been sharpened to razor edges. Techniques that have been passed down from father to son for generations. And rituals that honor both the animal's sacrifice and the gods who control the cycles of life and death. Every part, buys, of the animal will be used, because waste means death in this harsh environment. The meat will be smoked and dried. The fat will be rendered for cooking and lamp fuel. The hide will be tanned for leather. The bones will be carved into tools and ornaments, and even the blood will be made into sausage that provides essential nutrients during the lean months ahead. The smoking house is a small building designed specifically for preserving meat, with carefully controlled ventilation that allows smoke to circulate around hanging strips of beef while preventing the meat from cooking. You tend fires of specific woods, oak and birch and pine, each contributing flavors and preservative qualities that have been perfected over centuries of Norse experience. The work is constant, methodical, and absolutely critical. You slice meat, bend to strips of precise thickness, arrange them on wooden racks with careful spacing. Monitor the temperature and smoke density with attention that borders on obsession. A mistake in this process could mean spoiled meat, and spoiled meat could mean starvation before spring returns. Your wife works alongside you, her hands as skilled as yours in the arts of preservation. She renders fat in iron cauldrons, packing the resulting lard into ceramic vessels that will keep it fresh through the winter. She prepares the blood sausage, mixing blood with barley and fat and spices in proportions that have been memorized rather than written. Because Norse farmers don't read or write, they remember. Your children help according to their ages and abilities. The oldest tends the smoking fires, learning the precise balance of heat and ventilation that determines success or failure. The middle children clean and prepare the casings for sausages, work that requires patience and attention to detail. Even the youngest has tasks, collecting kindling, carrying water, learning through observation the skills they'll need to survive when they establish their own households. The preservation work continues for days, from before dawn until well after sunset, because the weather won't wait for human convenience. You work by firelight when necessary, by feel when your eyes are too tired to see clearly, with the knowledge that every hour of effort now could prevent a day of hunger later. Between the demands of meat preservation, you tend to other winter preparations. The root cellar must be stocked with turnips, carrots, and other vegetables that can survive months of storage in the cold, damp earth below your longhouse. These vegetables aren't fresh or particularly tasty, but they provide vitamins that prevent scurvy and other diseases that kill as surely as starvation. The grain harvest has already been completed, but the barley and oats must be processed into flour, a task that requires grinding with stone corns that reduce grain to powder through hours of repetitive motion. Your arms ache from turning the heavy stones, but flour is essential for bread, porridge, and the thick gruels that will sustain your family when fresh food runs out. Firewood is another constant concern, because a fire that goes out in a Norse winter can mean death for an entire household. You've spent weeks cutting and splitting birch, pine, and oak, stacking the wood in carefully constructed piles that shed rain and snow, while allowing air circulation that prevents rot. The woodpile outside your longhouse represents months of labor and the promise of warmth through the coming cold. Your tools require constant maintenance, because broken equipment in winter can be catastrophic when there's no way to replace or repair essential items. You sharpen axes, repair handles, oil leather, and check every piece of equipment that your survival depends upon. A dull blade, a cracked handle, or corroded metal could turn a routine task into a deadly emergency. The longhouse itself needs preparation for winter's assault. You check the roof for loose thatch, repair holes that could let in snow and wind, and ensure that the smoke holes are clear while remaining small enough to conserve heat. The walls are chinked with moss and mud to seal cracks, and extra insulation is added wherever cold might penetrate. Your livestock requires as much preparation as your family. Hay has been cut and dried during the summer, stored in quantities that must last until spring grass returns. The animals will spend the winter inside the longhouse, sharing space and warmth with humans, creating an environment that's crowded, smelly, and absolutely necessary for survival. The sheep provide wool that your wife spins into thread and weaves into cloth during the long winter evenings. This work continues throughout the cold months, producing the clothing, blankets, and other textiles that your family needs. The spinning wheel and loom are as essential to Norse survival as axes and plows, tools that transform raw materials into life-sustaining products. As winter deepens, your daily routine becomes increasingly focused on simple survival. Too awake to tend fires that have burned low during the night. Check on animals that provide warmth and will provide food if the preserved meat runs out. And monitor food stores that must last until spring returns months away. The cold is unlike anything modern people experience, a bone-deep chill that penetrates through layers of clothing and never fully goes away. Your hands become permanently numb, your feet ache constantly, and your breath creates clouds of vapor that freeze into ice crystals on your beard and clothing. Food becomes increasingly precious as winter progresses. The smoking meat is rationed, carefully supplemented with root vegetables, grain porridge, and whatever hunting can provide when weather permits. You learn to ignore hunger that gnaws constantly at your stomach, to find satisfaction in meals that would seem like starvation, poor rations to modern people. The darkness is as challenging as the cold, with winter days that last only a few hours and nights that stretch endlessly. You work by firelight and candlelight, perform essential tasks in near total darkness, and learn to navigate by feel and memory when vision fails. Social interaction becomes crucial for psychological survival during the months of isolation. Your family tells stories, sings songs, and maintains traditions that connect you to ancestors who survived the same challenges. These cultural activities aren't entertainment. They're essential mental health practices that prevent the despair and madness that can destroy people trapped in small spaces for months. The spring thaw, when it finally comes, feels like resurrection. Ice breaks up in the fjord with sounds like thunder. Snow melts to reveal ground that's been hidden for months, and the first green shoots appear like miracles in the black earth. You emerge from the longhouse like a hibernating animal, blinking in sunlight that seems impossibly bright after months of firelight. The cycle begins again, planting, tending, growing, harvesting. But you've survived another winter, your family, peas intact, and the knowledge gained through months of hardship will help you prepare for the next cycle. This is the rhythm of Viking farm life, an endless repetition of seasons that demands everything humans can give, and sometimes more than they have to offer. Your existence as a Norse farmer is a testament to human adaptability, determination, and the power of community cooperation in the face of challenges that seem impossible to overcome. You live on the edge of survival not by choice, but by geography and climate, in a place where nature is both magnificent and merciless. The fjord continues its ancient rhythm of seasons. The mountains stand unchanged, and new generations of Norse farmers continue the endless work of wresting survival from land that gives nothing. Your individual story is just one thread in a tapestry of human endurance that stretches back to the first people who dared to live in these harsh northern lands. Now, let me tell you about Olaf Eriksson, whose life represents the journey from young farmer to seasoned survivor, from optimistic settler to weather-beaten veteran of countless Norwegian winters. Olaf was born in 961 AD in the village of Skarvik, nestled deep in a fjord where the mountains rose so steeply from the water that sunlight reached the valley floor for only a few hours each day, even in summer. His father, Eric the Red-Bearded, was a farmer who had cleared his small patch of arable land from forest, so dense it seemed to fight back against human intrusion. The Eriksson farm consisted of a longhouse built from massive logs, a barn for animals and hay storage, a smithy where Eric repaired tools and forged simple implements, and fields carved from wilderness through years of back-breaking labor. The entire holding was perhaps 10 acres of usable land, surrounded by forests that stretched unbroken to the edge of the known world. Olaf's childhood was spent learning the skills that would keep him alive in a land where nature showed no mercy to the unprepared, the lazy, or the unlucky. By age 6, he could identify edible plants, track animals through snow, and perform simple farm tasks that contributed to family survival. By 10, he could handle an axe, tend livestock, and help with the endless work of food preservation that occupied every autumn. His education had nothing to do with books or formal learning, because Norse farmers lived in an oral culture where knowledge was passed down through demonstrations, repetition, and hard-won experience. Olaf learned to read weather patterns, to judge soil quality, to predict animal behavior, and to navigate by stars and landmarks in ways that kept him alive. When written maps would have been useless, the boy's first major responsibility came when he was 12, old enough to take the family's sheep to summer pastures high in the mountains, where grass grew thick and sweet during the brief warm season. This work required him to live alone for weeks, protecting the flock from wolves, bears, and the sudden storms that could kill both animals and shepherds without warning. Those summer months in the high pastures taught Olaf lessons that couldn't be learned in the safety of the farm. He learned to read the subtle signs that warned of approaching weather, to find shelter in landscapes that seemed to offer none, to make fire with wet wood, and to survive on whatever food the mountains provided. He also learned about loneliness, spending weeks without human contact except for occasional encounters with other shepherds, whose flocks grazed the same high meadow. These meetings were precious opportunities for news, trade, and the social interaction that kept mountain shepherds sane during their isolated vigils. When Olaf turned 16, his father began teaching him the more complex aspects of farming: when to plant different crops, how to judge soil readiness, how to manage livestock breeding, and how to calculate the food requirements that would carry a family through winter. These skills were matters of life and death, because mistakes in farming meant starvation in a land where there were no stores, no backup systems, and no one to rescue those who failed to provide for themselves. Olaf married Astrid Gunnar's when he was 22 and she was 18, a union arranged by their families but based on practical considerations rather than romantic love. Astrid was skilled in the women's work that was essential to survival: spinning, weaving, cooking, food preservation, herb lore, and the countless other tasks that kept Norse households functioning. The young couple established their own farm, built on land that Eric had cleared but never fully developed, a holding that required years of additional work before it could support a family. They built their longhouse with logs that Olaf cut himself, using techniques that had been perfected over generations of Norse building, creating a structure that would shelter their descendants for decades. Their first winter together nearly broke them. The longhouse was drafty, their food stores were insufficient, and they lacked the experience needed to manage livestock through the worst weather in living memory. They survived by eating every scrap of stored food, slaughtering animals they had planned to keep for breeding, and burning furniture when firewood ran low. Spring found them weakened, poorer but wiser about the demands of Norse survival. They had learned lessons that couldn't be taught, only experienced: how little food a human body actually needed, how much cold it could endure, how precious warmth and light became when they were scarce. Olaf and Astrid spent the next years building their farm into a viable operation. They cleared additional fields from forest, expanded their livestock holdings, and accumulated the tools, equipment, and supplies that made survival more likely with each passing season. Their success was measured not in wealth or comfort, but in the simple fact that they continued to live when so many others died. They had 6 children, 4 of whom survived to adulthood, a survival rate that was typical for Norse families who faced constant threats from disease, accident, and the harsh environment that claimed lives without regard for age or innocence. The children who lived were strong, adaptable, and trained from early childhood in the skills they would need to continue the family tradition of wresting survival from unforgiving land. Olaf's reputation as a farmer grew through the fjord community. As his crops prospered and his livestock multiplied, other farmers sought his advice about planting times, soil management, and animal husbandry. Knowledge that he shared freely because community survival benefited everyone in a land where neighbors might be the only source of help during emergencies. When Olaf was 35, a series of unusually harsh winters decimated farms throughout the region, killing livestock, destroying crops, and forcing families to abandon holdings that had been developed over generations. Olaf's farm survived because of careful preparation, conservative management, and the kind of cautious planning that anticipated disaster rather than hoping for the best. The survival of his farm during these crisis years established Olaf as an informal leader in the community, someone whose judgment was trusted and whose experience was valued. He helped organize cooperative efforts to share resources during emergencies, arranged marriages between families, and mediated disputes that could have destroyed the community cooperation essential for survival. As Olaf aged, he began training his eldest son to take over the farm, passing on decades of accumulated knowledge about farming, animal husbandry, weather prediction, and the countless other skills required for Norse survival. This training was intensive, detailed, and absolutely critical, because mistakes in farm management could kill not just the farmer, but his entire family. Olaf died at the age of 58, his body worn out by decades of physical labor in harsh conditions, but his farm continued under his son's management, supporting the next generation of Eriksson farmers who would face the same challenges. Their ancestors had conquered through determination, skill, and the kind of stubborn persistence that characterized Norse culture. His funeral was attended by farmers from throughout the fjord, men and women who understood that Olaf's death marked the end of an era, but also the continuation of traditions that had sustained Norse communities for generations. He was buried with his farming tools, his favorite axe, and grave goods that would serve him in whatever afterlife awaited farmers who had served their families and communities faithfully. Olaf Eriksson represented the best of Norse farming culture. Practical, resilient, community-minded, and completely devoted to the work of survival in one of the world's most challenging environments. His life demonstrated that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when necessity demanded adaptation to conditions that would destroy those who lacked determination or skill. In the winter of 994 AD, something extraordinary began, happening in the fjord settlements throughout western Norway. It started with reports from isolated farms about livestock that cared for themselves, crops that grew without planting, and food stores that replenished themselves during the lean months when starvation threatened even the most carefully prepared households. The first incidents were reported by Gunnar Thorsen, an elderly farmer whose family had nearly starved during a particularly harsh winter that killed most of their animals and exhausted their food supplies before spring returned. Gunnar reported waking one morning to find his empty grain barrels filled with barley, his depleted meat stores restocked with smoked fish, and his dying cattle miraculously restored to health. Similar reports came from farms throughout the region, describing identical phenomena: empty root cellars that filled themselves overnight, sick animals that recovered without treatment, and food preservation that continued without human intervention. The supernatural assistance seemed most intense at farms where families were closest to starvation, as if some benevolent force was intervening to prevent the deaths that harsh winters claimed every year. Olaf Eriksson, now an experienced farmer with detailed knowledge of agricultural cycles and livestock management, initially dismissed these reports as wishful thinking or exaggeration born of desperation. But when he witnessed similar phenomena at his own farm, he was forced to acknowledge that something beyond normal experience was occurring in the fjord communities. The mysterious assistance wasn't limited to food and livestock. Farmers reported finding their firewood chopped and stacked without human effort, their tools repaired and sharpened overnight, and their buildings maintained by invisible hands that performed the endless maintenance work required to keep Norse farms operational. Most remarkably, the supernatural help seemed to understand the specific needs of individual farms, providing exactly what each family required for survival without waste or excess. Families with young children received milk and soft foods. Households with elderly members received easily digestible provisions, and farms with sick livestock received the specific treatments that restored animal health. Brother Magnus, a Christian monk who had established a small monastery in a neighboring valley, was consulted about the supernatural reports from a religious perspective. His investigation convinced him that the phenomena were genuine, though he struggled to determine whether they represented divine intervention, pagan magic, or forces beyond theological understanding. Brother Magnus's theological interpretation suggested that the harsh conditions of Norse life had created spiritual circumstances where divine mercy manifested as practical assistance for families facing starvation and death. He proposed that God was providing for his children in their time of greatest need, using means that transcended normal natural processes. But the Norse farmers had their own explanations rooted in traditional beliefs about land spirits, ancestral ghosts, and the supernatural forces that governed agricultural success. They believed that the spirits of dead farmers were returning to help their descendants survive the same challenges that had claimed their own lives, creating a cycle of assistance that connected the living with the dead. The supernatural assistance continued throughout the winter, gradually becoming more organized and systematic. Families reported encountering ghostly figures who performed farm work with skill that exceeded human capabilities, who understood livestock needs better than experienced farmers, and who worked with efficiency that suggested otherworldly knowledge. Some farmers claimed to recognize the spectral workers as ancestors who had died during previous harsh winters, family members who had returned to ensure that their descendants survived the challenges that had defeated them. These encounters were described as comforting rather than frightening, suggesting that the supernatural intervention was motivated by love and concern rather than malevolent intent. The mysterious help seemed to fade as spring returned, and the immediate threat of starvation passed. The ghostly workers appeared less frequently. The supernatural restocking of food stores stopped, and normal agricultural routines resumed as the growing season began. But the effects of the winter assistance had prevented deaths that would otherwise have been inevitable. Community leaders documented the period carefully, noting that survival rates during the harsh winter had been significantly higher than in previous years of similar severity, that livestock losses had been minimal despite extreme weather, and that food supplies had lasted longer than careful calculation suggested was possible. The farmers who experienced the supernatural assistance never forgot the winter when invisible helpers had saved their families from starvation and death. Many credited the ghostly intervention with preserving their family lines, allowing children to survive who would otherwise have died, ensuring that Norse farming communities continued despite challenges that should have been insurmountable. The phenomena became part of local folklore, stories passed down through generations of farmers who found in them both comfort and explanation for their ability to survive conditions that seemed to exceed human endurance. The ghostly farmers represented hope that those who had gone before would continue to care for those who remained, that death was not the end of family, responsibility, and community concern. Modern researchers have proposed various explanations for the Norse farming mysteries: hallucinations caused by malnutrition and stress, community cooperation disguised as supernatural intervention, or collective mythology created to cope with psychological trauma of near-starvation experiences. But the detailed records kept by monastery scribes, the testimony of credible witnesses, including community leaders and visiting clergy, and the documented improvements in survival rates suggest that something genuinely unexplained occurred during that harsh winter in the Norwegian fjords. The mystery highlighted the sparse psychological and spiritual resources that Norse communities developed to cope with environmental challenges that regularly threatened entire populations with death. Whether real or imagined, the ghostly assistance provided hope, comfort, and practical benefits that helped farming families survive the worst winter in living memory. The supernatural farmers represented the Norse understanding that survival was not just an individual responsibility, but a community obligation that extended beyond death, connecting the living with the dead in bonds of mutual assistance that transcended the normal boundaries of mortality. While Olaf Eriksson struggled to survive in his isolated fjord farm, a completely different world existed in the great halls of Norwegian Jarl, where Viking wealth supported lifestyles of unprecedented luxury built on the labor of farmers and the profits from raiding expeditions that brought treasures from across the known world. Jarl Harald Bluetooth ruled from a great hall at Trondheim that could accommodate 300 warriors during feasts, ceremonies, and the elaborate social rituals that demonstrated his power throughout Northern Europe. His wealth came from taxes collected from farmers like Olaf, tribute extracted from conquered territories, and the portable riches that Viking raiders brought back from monasteries, cities, and trading centers they had pillaged. Harald woke each mourning in chambers hung with tapestries looted from Irish monasteries, slept in beds decorated with gold and silver that had been melted down from church treasures, and began each day with a breakfast that would have fed 20 farming families. For a week, his morning routine included being dressed by servants in clothing made from silk that had traveled the length of Europe, jewelry crafted from precious metals stolen from distant lands, and weapons forged by the finest smiths using techniques learned from captured craftsmen. The contrast between Harold's lifestyle and Olaf's existence was so extreme that they seemed to inhabit different worlds rather than the same Norwegian kingdom. The Jarl consumed in a single feast what farming families saved for entire seasons, wasted casually what working people desperately needed, and enjoyed luxuries that represented the accumulated wealth of entire communities. Harold's Great Hall was a monument to Viking success in war and trade. Massive wooden beams carved with scenes of battle and victory. Walls hung with shields and weapons taken from defeated enemies. Tables that could seat hundreds of warriors during the elaborate feasts that maintained social bonds among the fighting men who supported Jarl power. The daily routine of Jarl life was structured around activities that served military and political purposes rather than productive labor. Harold spent hours in weapons practice, political meetings with subordinate chiefs, and the complex social ceremonies that maintained his authority over warriors, who served him voluntarily and could transfer their loyalty to more successful leaders. His beals were elaborate productions that demonstrated wealth, power, and the ability to provide for followers who expected generous treatment in exchange for military service. These feasts featured roasted meats that had been hunted in royal forests, imported delicacies that cost fortunes, and ale brewed from grain that farmers had grown while their own families went hungry. Harold's clothing represented wealth beyond the imagination of farming people. Furs from Arctic animals that required months of hunting to obtain, metals worked into intricate jewelry by master craftsmen, and fabrics dyed with colors that could only be achieved using expensive imported materials. When Harold traveled to visit subordinate settlements, which he did regularly to maintain political control and collect tribute, the contrast between his world and farmer existence became starkly apparent. He would arrive with retinues of armed warriors, demand hospitality that strained local resources, and expect entertainment and gifts that represented months of agricultural production. These visits were carefully orchestrated displays of power that served both political and economic purposes. Harold would review the tribute payments that supported his lifestyle, settle disputes between local leaders, and demonstrate the military force that made resistance futile for farming communities that could never match Jarl resources. The Jarl's understanding of farming was purely extractive, based on his need for taxes and tribute rather than any appreciation for the work required to produce agricultural surplus. He saw farmers as sources of revenue rather than as human beings whose survival depended on careful management of limited resources. Harold's wealth allowed him to maintain warriors who served no productive purpose except violence and intimidation. Men whose entire existence was devoted to combat, raiding, and the projection of force that kept farming communities obedient and tribute flowing toward Jarl coffers. When Harold died at the age of 54, killed in a raid against Irish monasteries that went wrong when local defenders proved better prepared than expected, his death was mourned by the warrior class who had benefited from his successful leadership, but barely noticed by farming communities, who continued their work regardless of which Jarl extracted tribute from their labor. His funeral was a spectacular affair that consumed wealth equivalent to what hundreds of farming families produced in years of agricultural work, demonstrating the vast inequality that characterized Viking society and the concentration of resources in the hands of military elites who contributed nothing to food production. The contrast between Harold's luxury and Olaf's struggle represented the fundamental structure of Norse society, where farming communities supported warrior elites through tribute and taxation, where productive labor subsidized military adventures, and where the majority of people lived in poverty, so that a small minority could enjoy unprecedented wealth and power. Harold and Olaf lived in the same region, were subject to the same weather and seasonal cycles, and depended ultimately on the same agricultural resources. But they experienced completely different realities based on their positions in social hierarchies that concentrated wealth upward while distributing hardship downward. Both were products of the same Viking culture, but they represented opposite extremes of Norse social organization. One as beneficiary of a system that extracted wealth from agricultural productions, the other as victim of arrangements that transferred the fruits of farming labor to military elites who used violence to maintain their privileged positions. The Viking Age created these vast inequalities through military conquests, political organization, and economic systems that treated farming as a resource to be exploited rather than as honorable work, deserving of respect and adequate compensation for the essential services it provided to Norse society. By the year 1015, the fjord farming communities had developed systems of cooperation, resource sharing, and mutual assistance that helped them survive the constant demands of both natural hardship and political exploitation. These informal networks provided security that neither individual farming nor official governance could supply. Olaf Eriksson, now in his 50s and recognized as an informal leader among the farming families, had helped organize these cooperative arrangements through decades of experience with the challenges that threatened agricultural communities throughout the region. The farmers had learned that survival required not just individual skill and preparation, but community coordination that could respond to emergencies, share resources during crises, and provide assistance to families whose farms failed despite careful management and hard work. These networks operated outside official political structures because Jarl authority was focused on tribute collection rather than farmer welfare, and because farming communities understood that their survival depended on their own efforts rather than protection from political leaders who viewed them as sources of revenue. The cooperation included shared labor during critical periods like harvest and slaughter, coordinated resource distribution during emergency shortages, and informal systems of information sharing that helped all farmers improve their techniques and avoid mistakes that could prove fatal. Children were educated within these community networks, learning not just farming skills but also the social cooperation that made survival possible in harsh environments where individual families lacked the resources to overcome major challenges independently. Marriage arrangements connected farming families across wide geographic areas, creating kinship networks that provided mutual support, shared resources, and collaborative problem-solving that enhanced survival prospects for entire extended family groups. The farming communities had achieved a level of stability and resilience that allowed them to maintain population, improve agricultural techniques, and preserve cultural traditions despite the constant pressures of environmental hardship and political exploitation that threatened their existence. Their success was measured not in wealth or luxury, but in the simple fact that they continued to exist, to produce food, to raise children, and to maintain the agricultural foundation that supported Norse civilization even as military elites claimed credit for Viking achievements. As the Viking Age entered its final phases, the experiences of farmers like Olaf Eriksson provided lessons about human adaptability, community cooperation, and the importance of agricultural production in sustaining complex societies that depended on farming labor, while often failing to appreciate its value. Their stories demonstrated that ordinary people could create meaningful lives and stable communities, even under conditions that seemed designed to destroy human happiness and social cooperation. That survival was possible through mutual assistance and shared commitment to common welfare. And so we leave the fjords of Norway, where the mountains rose like walls against the sky, where farmers fought daily battles against cold that could kill, seasons that demanded perfect timing, and land that gave nothing without extracting payment. In human suffering, these determined Norse farmers lived lives of extraordinary endurance, rising before dawn in darkness that lasted months, working until exhaustion claimed them, serving natural rhythms that transformed human beings into partners with forces far greater than individual will or desire. Olaf Eriksson and countless others like them, devoted their lives to wresting survival from land that tested every human capability, that demanded perfect preparation for winters that could last half the year, that rewarded skill and punished carelessness with death that came swift and certain to those who failed to respect natural law. The fjords still cut deep into Norwegian mountains, their dark waters reflecting peaks that have remained unchanged since Viking farmers first cleared their tiny fields from ancient forests. Tourists visit these magnificent landscapes, marveling at natural beauty that seems designed for contemplation rather than the grinding work of agricultural survival. The longhouses have fallen into ruin, their massive logs returning to earth that once supported families through countless winters. The fields that farmers like Olaf carved from wilderness have returned to forest, reclaimed by trees that waited patiently for human cultivation to cease its temporary victory over natural process. But the legacy of Norse farmers lives on in every community that cooperates for mutual survival, every family that prepares carefully for hard times, every person who understands that human civilization depends ultimately on the willingness of some to work with land, seasons, and natural cycles that care nothing for human comfort or convenience. As you drift off to sleep tonight in your heated room, with food that required no personal effort to obtain, remember the Viking farmers in their smoky, sharing space with livestock that provided warmth, eating preserved meat that represented months of careful preparation, burning wood that they had cut and split by hand. Their struggles are over, their longhouses empty, their voices silenced by the passage of 1,000 years. But their story continues. In every place where humans must cooperate with natural forces, every community that depends on agricultural production, every family that understands the difference between survival and comfort, the Norse farmers knew. Something that our comfortable world often forgets, that civilization is built on the foundation of agricultural work, that survival requires preparation and cooperation, that individual success means nothing without community stability that supports everyone through challenges that no person can face alone. Olaf Eriksson spent 58 years fighting Norwegian winters and growing food in conditions that would defeat modern farmers equipped with advanced technology, climate control, and global supply chains. His victory was not wealth or fame, but the simple fact that his family line continued, that his knowledge was passed to children who used it to survive their own challenges. Sleep well, knowing that your warmth is guaranteed, that your food supply is secure, that your survival doesn't depend on perfect timing, endless preparation, and cooperation with neighbors whose success determines your own welfare. The Norse farmers earned these securities for us. Through their endurance, their skill, and their faith, that individual sacrifice could serve purposes larger than personal comfort. Their fires have gone cold. Their fields have returned to forest. Their names are forgotten except in family stories passed down through generations. But somewhere in farming communities around the world, their tradition continues, carried on by people who understand that someone must work with land and seasons. Someone must grow food. Someone must pay the price that agriculture demands from those who would feed human civilization. Good night, Colonial American Blacksmiths. You are a blacksmith in Colonial, Massachusetts. In the year 1692, the forge fire burns constantly in your workshop, a roaring heart of flame that consumes coal and charcoal like a hungry beast, demanding constant feeding, careful tending, and the kind of attention that becomes second nature after years of working with fire that can forge irons or burn flesh with equal indifference. Your day begins before dawn, not because any bell calls you to work, but because the forge fire must be coaxed back to life from the embers that have glowed through the night. The workshop is dark, filled with the acrid smell of coal smoke, hot metal, and the ever-present scent of sweat that comes from working in heat that would overwhelm softer men. You dress in leather apron that bears the scars of 1,000 sparks, woolen shirt that has been singed countless times by flying embers, and breeches thick enough to protect your legs from the heat that radiates from forge and anvil. Your hands are permanently blackened with soot and coal dust, scarred from contact with hot metal, and calloused from gripping hammer handles that have worn smooth from decades of use. The bellows require your first attention. Massive leather lungs that force air into the forge fire, creating temperatures hot enough to make iron malleable, workable, ready to be shaped into the tools, nails, horseshoes, and implements that colonial life demands. Pube bellows with rhythmic precision, watching the fire respond to each breath of forced air, learning to read the flames like a language written in heat and light. The coal must be arranged properly, not too much that smothers the flame, not too little that fails to generate the heat necessary for ironwork. You've learned through years of experience to judge fuel requirements by the work ahead, to anticipate the forge's appetite, to feed it exactly what it needs without waste that would cost precious money in a colony where everything useful must be imported or made by hand. Your first task is heating the iron stock that will become today's projects, sliding links of black metal into the fire's heart, watching for the color changes that indicate proper temperature for forging. Iron speaks to you through color: black for cold, red for warm, orange for workable, yellow for dangerous, white for ruined. Learning this language took years of mistakes, burned fingers, and ruined work. The anvil stands like an altar in the center of your workshop. 200 pounds of hardened steel that has absorbed thousands of hammer blows, shaped countless pieces of ironwork, and bears the scars of every project you've completed. This anvil was your father's before you, shipped from England at enormous cost, and it will outlast your children if they choose to continue the family trade. You pull the heated iron from the forge with long-handled tongs, metal pincers that have become extensions of your hands, tools that allow you to grasp, move, and position hot metal without burning flesh that would heal slowly and never quite recover from serious forge burns. The iron glows like a piece of captured fire, radiating heat that makes the air shimmer and dance. The hammer rises and falls with mechanical precision, striking heated iron in rhythms that have been perfected through generations of blacksmiths. Learn their trade through apprenticeship experience, and the kind of patient repetition that creates muscle memory stronger than conscious thought. Each blow shapes the metal, forces it into new configurations, transforms raw iron into useful objects. The sound of hammer on anvil creates a music that fills the workshop, echoes through the colonial village, and marks the passage of working. Hours with steady beats that never vary in tempo or intensity. This rhythm becomes the soundtrack of your existence, a mechanical heartbeat that follows you home and haunts your dreams with its constant, hypnotic repetition. Sparks fly with every hammer blow, tiny pieces of molten metal that arc through the workshop air like falling stars, landing on your apron, your arms, your face with stings that you've learned to ignore through years of constant exposure. These sparks are beautiful and dangerous, creating patterns of light that would be magical if they weren't so commonplace in the blacksmith's daily experience. The work requires strength that most colonial men don't possess, endurance that exceeds normal human capabilities, and heat tolerance that transforms your body into something approaching iron itself. Your muscles develop specifically for forge work. Your hands become tools as specialized as any implement in the workshop, and your skin thickens to provide protection against the constant assault of heat, sparks, and rough metal. Between hammer blows, you return the iron to the forge, reheating metal that cools quickly in the workshop air, maintaining the orange glow that indicates proper working temperature. This cycle of heating, hammering, and reheating continues for hours, requires perfect timing, and demands attention that never wavers despite the monotonous repetition of identical tasks. Today's project is horseshoes, curved pieces of iron that will protect colonial horses from stones, thorns, bye, and the rough ground that damages hooves and can lame valuable animals that represent major investments for farmers, merchants, and travelers who depend on horses for transportation and agricultural work. Each horseshoe must be shaped to fit individual hooves, curved to match the animal's foot, and drilled with nail holes that secure the shoe without damaging sensitive tissue. This work requires precision that seems impossible given the crude tools and intense heat that make fine measurements difficult. But you've developed the eye and hand coordination necessary for metalwork that must fit perfectly or fail completely. The forge fire burns through enormous quantities of fuel, coal that costs money you can barely afford, charcoal that you make yourself from hardwood that takes days to burn properly in earthen kilns that require constant tending. Fuel costs are always on your mind, because inefficient burning means poverty, and poverty means failure in a colonial economy that offers no safety net for craftsmen who can't make their businesses profitable. Customers arrive throughout the day, farmers needing plow points sharpened, housewives requiring pot repairs, and fellow craftsmen seeking specialized tools that only blacksmiths can create. Each customer brings different requirements, unique challenges, and the expectation that you can solve problems involving metal, heat, and mechanical stress that others can't understand or address. The colonial economy depends on blacksmiths' services for tools, hardware, and repairs that keep farms productive, households functioning, and businesses operating. You're not just a craftsman, but an essential component of colonial survival, because broken tools mean failed crops, and failed crops mean starvation in communities that produce most of their own food. Your workshop contains dozens of specialized tools, each designed for specific aspects of metalwork, hammers of different weights for various tasks, tongs shaped for gripping different iron stock, punches for creating holes, chisels for cutting metal, and files for finishing work that must be smooth and precise. These tools represent years of investment, careful maintenance, and the accumulated knowledge of generations of blacksmiths who developed implements specifically for forge work. Many of your tools are homemade, created during slow periods to solve particular problems or improve efficiency in repetitive tasks that consume most of your working hours. The heat in the workshop becomes overwhelming during summer months, when forge fire combines with seasonal temperatures to create working conditions that approach the limits of human endurance. You learn to work quickly during the hottest hours, to take breaks when the heat threatens heat exhaustion, and to drink enormous quantities of water that your body demands to replace what's lost through constant sweating. Winter brings different challenges because forge heat that's welcome during cold months can't reach all areas of the workshop, creating temperature variations that affect metalworking properties and require constant adjustment of techniques that work perfectly during moderate weather. Your hands are your most valuable tools, trained through years of practice to judge metal temperature by touch, to estimate hammer force required for different tasks, and to manipulate tongs, hammers, and iron stock with precision that exceeds any measuring instrument available in colonial workshops. But hands are also your most vulnerable assets, constantly exposed to burns, cuts, and injuries that can end a blacksmith's career instantly. If damage is severe enough to destroy the manual dexterity that metalwork demands, you've learned to work carefully without working slowly, to protect your hands while maintaining the efficiency that keeps customers satisfied and bills paid. The apprentice system brings young men to your workshop, boys who want to learn blacksmithing but have no understanding of the physical demands, mental concentration, and years of patient practice required to master forge work. Teaching apprentices requires patience you don't always possess, but it also provides extra hands for simple tasks and ensures that blacksmithing knowledge continues to the next generation. Most apprentices quit within months, defeated by heat, exhaustion, and the realization that blacksmithing is harder work than they imagined. The few who persist gradually develop the strength, skill, and mental toughness required for forge work. But this process takes years and requires constant supervision that slows your own productivity. The economic pressures of colonial blacksmithing are constant because customers expect high-quality work at prices they can afford. But materials and fuel costs continue rising, while competition from other craftsmen keeps prices low. You must balance quality, speed, and cost in ways that satisfy customers, while generating enough income to support your family and maintain your workshop. Raw iron is expensive, imported from England or smelted in colonial furnaces using techniques that produce metal of variable quality. You learn to work with iron that ranges from excellent to barely usable, adjusting techniques to accommodate material differences that affect every aspect of forge work. The social position of blacksmiths in colonial communities is complex, because your skills are essential, but your work is manual labor that places you below merchants, professionals, and large landowners in social hierarchies that determine political influence, marriage opportunities, and community respect. However, your specialized knowledge and essential services also provide independence that agricultural workers lack, steady income that many colonists envy, and the satisfaction that comes from creating useful objects through skill and hard work that transforms raw materials into finished products. The forge fire burns throughout your working life, consuming fuel, demanding attention, and providing the heat that makes your livelihood possible. This fire becomes the center of your existence, a partner that requires constant care but provides the means for supporting family, serving community, and practicing a craft that connects you to metalworkers throughout human history. Your workshop befills with the products of decades of work, tools you've made for yourself, practice pieces created while learning new techniques, and examples of your best work that demonstrate capabilities to potential customers. These objects represent accumulated skill, years of experience, and the gradual development of abilities that transform an apprentice into a master. Craftsman. The rhythm of forge work becomes the rhythm of your life, measured not in hours or days, but in the cycles of heating, hammering, and cooling that transform iron stock into finished products. This rhythm is hypnotic, meditative, and completely absorbing, creating a kind of working trance that makes time pass quickly despite the physical demands of constant labor. Your body adapts to forge work through changes that mark you permanently. As a blacksmith, enlarged forearms from hammerwork, heat tolerance that allows you to work comfortably in temperatures that disable other men, and hand strength that exceeds anything required for normal colonial activities. But this adaptation comes at a cost measured in joint pain, back problems, and the premature aging that results from years of exposure to extreme heat, physical stress, and working conditions that gradually break down human bodies regardless of strength, skill, or determination. The evening ends your official working day, but forge maintenance continues into the night as you bank the fire for tomorrow's work, clean and organize tools, and plan projects that will fill the following day with the same rhythm of heating, hammering, and shaping that defines blacksmith existence. Sleep comes easily because forge work exhausts your body completely, but dreams are filled with the sounds of hammer on anvil, the sight of glowing iron, and the heat that follows you even into unconsciousness, where your mind continues working with metal, fire, and the endless cycle of creation that transformed raw materials into objects essential for colonial survival. Tomorrow will bring the same forge fire, the same hammer rhythms, the same challenges of working with heat, metal, and customer demands that never change despite decades of repetition. This is your life as a colonial blacksmith, an existence built around fire and iron, measured in hammer blows, and devoted to the endless work of shaping metal into forms that serve human needs. The forge continues burning, the iron continues glowing, and your hammer continues falling in patterns that connect you to every blacksmith who has ever worked with fire and metal, creating objects that outlast their makers and serve purposes that justify the heat, effort, and sacrifice required to transform raw iron into tools for human use. Now, let me tell you about Ezra Whitmore, whose life represents the journey from apprentice blacksmith to master craftsman, from struggling beginner to respected artisan whose skills sustained colonial communities through the challenges of frontier survival. Ezra was born in 1648 in the village of Dedham, Massachusetts, to a family of farmers who worked land that had been cleared from wilderness just 20 years earlier by English colonists, who brought agricultural techniques suitable for a much different climate and soil than they found in New England. His father, Samuel Whitmore, was a carpenter who had learned his trade in England, but found that colonial conditions required different skills, new techniques, and adaptations to materials and tools that weren't available in frontier communities. Samuel's workshop produced furniture, building components, and wooden implements, but he recognized that his son's interests lay in a different direction. Ezra was fascinated by metal from early childhood, drawn to the blacksmith shop that served Dedham's growing population, mesmerized by the transformation of cold iron into glowing, malleable material that could be shaped into any form the craftsman's skill could imagine. He spent hours watching Master Thomas Hartwell work at forge and anvil, learning through observation the rhythms and techniques of metalworking. When Ezra turned 14, his father arranged an apprenticeship with Master Hartwell, a 7-year agreement that would transform a curious boy into a skilled craftsman through training that combined formal instruction, practical experience, and the gradual development of abilities that couldn't be learned quickly or easily. The apprenticeship began with the most basic tasks: maintaining the forge fire, organizing tools, preparing iron stock, and cleaning the workshop at the end of each working day. These tasks seemed simple but required learning the fundamentals that supported all advanced blacksmithing, understanding fire behavior, recognizing tool functions, and developing work habits that would serve throughout a craftsman's career. First year was devoted to building physical strength necessary for forge work, developing heat tolerance that would allow him to work comfortably near temperatures that could kill the unprepared, and learning to handle tools safely in an environment where carelessness could result in severe burns, cuts, or worse injuries. Master Hartwell was a demanding teacher who had trained dozens of apprentices during his 30 years as Dedham's blacksmith. He understood that blacksmithing required not just manual skills, but mental discipline, attention to detail, and the kind of patience that develops only through years of practice with techniques that must be mastered completely before they become useful. Iron has its own nature, Hartwell told Ezra during his second year of training. You can't force it to do what you want. You have to understand what it wants to do, then guide it toward what you need. The hammer doesn't reshape iron by strength alone. but by working with the metal's own properties to achieve the shape you're seeking. This lesson was fundamental to everything Ezra would learn about metalworking. That blacksmithing was not simply about applying force to resistant materials, but about understanding the behavior of heated iron and using that knowledge to achieve desired results through skill rather than brute strength. Ezra's third year brought instruction in basic forging techniques, drawing out iron to make it longer and thinner, upsetting to make it shorter and thicker, bending to create curves and angles, and punching holes for nails, bolts, and other fasteners. Each technique required different hammer skills, different heat management, and different approaches to shaping metal. The drawing out process taught Ezra to stretch iron by hammering along its length, gradually extending the metal while maintaining uniform thickness and avoiding the thin spots that would create weak points in finished pieces. This work required careful attention to heat distribution, hammer angle, and the gradual progression that transformed short, thick iron stock into long, thin rods, suitable for nails, chains, and other linear products. Upsetting required different play skills, compressing iron to make it thicker and shorter, creating the enlarged heads on nails, the thick sections needed for tool eyes, and the bulk necessary for heavy-duty applications. This technique demanded precise hammer control, because too much force would split the iron while too little would fail to achieve the necessary compression. Bending taught Ezra to create curves, angles, and complex shapes without cracking or weakening the iron, using gradual force applied at proper temperatures to achieve smooth transitions that maintained metal strength while creating the configurations required for horseshoes, brackets, hinges, and countless other products. Punching holes required specialized tools and techniques that created clean openings without damaging surrounding metal, a skill essential for creating nail holes in horseshoes, eye holes in tools, and the countless perforations that allowed iron products to be fastened, hung, tore, or assembled into larger structures. Ezra's fourth year focused on tool making, learning to create the specialized implements that blacksmiths required for their work. Hammers of different weights and configurations, tongs shaped for gripping, various iron stock punches and chisels for specific tasks, and files for finishing work that required smooth surfaces. Making his own tools taught Ezra to understand the relationship between form and function in metal, to appreciate the precision required for implements that would be used daily under demanding conditions, and to develop the skills necessary for creating products that met professional standards rather than simple apprentice practice pieces. The fifth year brought instruction in advanced techniques, welding pieces of iron together to create larger or more complex objects, heat treating to harden tools and cutting edges, and tempering to achieve the precise balance between hardness and brittleness that characterized excellent ironwork. Welding required perfect heat management, bringing two pieces of iron to exactly the right temperature before hammering them together with force and precision that created seamless joints, stronger than the original metal. This technique was essential for creating large objects from smaller pieces of iron stock, for repairing broken tools, and for adding steel cutting edges to iron tools. Heat treating transformed the properties of iron and steel, making them harder, more durable, and suitable for cutting applications that required edges sharp enough to cut wood, stone, or other metals. This process required understanding the relationship between temperature, cooling rate, and final metal properties that weren't visible but determined tool performance. Tempering followed heat treating, reducing brittleness that made hardened tools prone to cracking while maintaining the hardness necessary for cutting performance. This delicate process required judgment, experience, and understanding of visual cues that indicated proper temperature for achieving desired results. Ezra's 6th year was devoted to developing speed and efficiency in techniques he had already learned, because professional blacksmithing required producing quality work quickly enough to generate adequate income while maintaining standards that satisfied demanding customers. The 7th and final year of apprenticeship focused on business skill, estimating material requirements, pricing work appropriately, managing customer relationships, and understanding the economic realities that determined success or failure in colonial craftsmanship. When Ezra completed his apprenticeship in 1669, he was 21 years old and possessed skills that had taken 7 years to develop but would serve him throughout his working life. Master Hartwell provided a letter of recommendation that certified Ezra's competence and character, essential credentials for establishing his own blacksmith business. Ezra spent 2 years working as a journeyman for other blacksmiths, gaining experience with different techniques, regional variations in customer demands, and business practices that varied among established craftsmen. This period provided practical education in the realities of independent blacksmithing, while allowing him to save money for establishing his own shop. In 1671, Ezra married Sarah Goodwin, the daughter of Dedham's miller, in a union that combined practical considerations with genuine affection. Sarah brought skills in household management, basic business accounting, and the social connections that would help establish Ezra's reputation in the community where he planned to practice his trade. Ezra established his blacksmith shop in the village of Medfield, a growing community that needed a resident blacksmith to serve local farmers, craftsmen, and the increasing population that was expanding westward from established coastal settlements. His shop was located at the intersection of 2 main roads, ensuring exposure to travelers who might require emergency repairs or specialized metalwork. The shop building was constructed according to specifications. Ezra had learned during his apprenticeship stone walls that wouldn't burn if forged sparks ignited nearby materials, a chimney designed to draw smoke efficiently while containing sparks, and workspace organized for maximum efficiency in the workflow that moved iron stock from storage through forging to finished products. Ezra's first years in independent practice tested every skill he had learned during apprenticeship while teaching. New lessons about customer relations, business management, and the constant challenges of maintaining profitability while providing services essential to community survival. His customer base included local farmers who needed plow points, horseshoes, and tool repairs, households requiring pot mending, nail making, and hardware for construction projects, and fellow craftsmen seeking specialized tools that only blacksmiths could create or modify. The seasonal nature of agricultural work created predictable patterns in customer demand. Spring brought plow repairs and tool sharpening as farmers prepared for planting. Summer required horseshoe work as travel increased. Autumn demanded slaughter tools and food preservation equipment. And winter provided time for major projects that couldn't be completed during busy agricultural seasons. Ezra developed reputation for quality work, fair pricing, and reliable service that gradually expanded his customer base beyond Medfield to include surrounding communities whose residents were willing to travel for blacksmithing that met their standards for durability and craftsmanship. The success of his business allowed Ezra and Sarah to purchase land adjacent to the shop, build a substantial house, and start a family that eventually included 5 children, 3 of whom survived to adulthood in an era when childhood mortality remained high despite improving colonial living conditions. Ezra trained his own apprentices, passing on the skills and knowledge he had learned from Master Hartwell while adapting techniques to reflect changes in available materials. Customer demand, buyer and technological innovations that gradually transformed blacksmithing throughout the colonial period. When Ezra was 45 years old, his reputation as a skilled craftsman and reliable businessman led to his election as selectman for Medfield, a position that involved him in community governance, while maintaining his blacksmithing practice that remained his primary source of income and professional identity. His dual role as craftsman and community leader reflected the respect that praised skilled blacksmiths could achieve in colonial society, where practical abilities were valued highly and success in essential trades could translate into social prominence and political influence. Ezra continued blacksmithing until he was 68 years old, when arthritis and the accumulated effects of decades of forge work made the physical demands of metalworking too difficult to sustain. He sold his business to a former apprentice who had developed the skills and business acumen necessary for continuing the shop's service to Medfield and surrounding communities. He died in 1728 at the age of 80, having lived through the transformation of Massachusetts from struggling frontier settlements to established communities with stable economies, growing populations, and the infrastructure necessary for supporting specialized crafts like blacksmithing. Ezra's funeral was attended by dozens of customers whose tools, horseshoes, and metalwork bore evidence of his skill, fellow craftsmen who respected his abilities and business success, and community leaders who recognized his contributions to Medfield's development during 4 decades of residence and service. Ezra Whitmore represented the best of colonial craftsmanship, skilled, reliable, community-minded, and completely devoted to maintaining standards that served customers well, while building businesses that supported families and contributed to community stability and growth. In the summer of 1676, something extraordinary began happening in blacksmith shops throughout the Massachusetts Bay Colony. It started with reports from craftsmen about tools that sharpened themselves, forge fires that maintained perfect temperatures without human intervention, and metalwork that achieved levels of quality that exceeded anything human skill alone could produce. The first incidents were reported by Master John Prescott, whose blacksmith shop in Concord had served the community for over 20 years without encountering anything that couldn't be explained by normal craftsmanship, material properties, or the established techniques that generations of metalworkers had developed through experience and training. Prescott reported arriving at his shop one morning to find that work he had left unfinished the previous evening had been completed during the night, with craftsmanship that exceeded his own considerable abilities. Horseshoes had been shaped to perfect specifications. Tools had been forged with precision that seemed impossible, given the crude measuring devices available to colonial blacksmiths, and complex projects had been advanced significantly without any evidence of human presence. Similar reports came from blacksmith shops throughout the colony, describing identical phenomena: work completed by invisible hands, forge fires that burned efficiently without constant tending, and finished products that demonstrated skills exceeding anything individual craftsmen had achieved through years of professional practice. The mysterious assistance wasn't limited to simple tasks, but included complex metalwork that required advanced techniques, specialized knowledge, and the kind of experience that developed only through decades of professional blacksmithing. Ghost craftsmen seemed to understand tool making, weapon forging, and architectural ironwork with expertise that exceeded living blacksmiths. Ezra Whitmore, now an established craftsman with detailed knowledge of forge work and metalworking techniques, initially dismissed these reports as exaggeration born of professional rivalry or attempts to explain unusually successful work periods through supernatural rather than natural causes. But when Ezra witnessed similar phenomena at his own shop, he was forced to acknowledge that something beyond normal experience was occurring in colonial blacksmithing. He discovered tools he hadn't made, repairs completed without his involvement, and work advanced significantly during hours when the shop had been unoccupied and secured. The phantom blacksmiths seemed to work with invisible tools, undetectable forges and techniques that produced results without leaving evidence of the processes used to achieve them. Finished work appeared without creating the noise, smoke, or other byproducts that normally accompanied forge operations. Most remarkably, the supernatural assistants seemed to understand individual customer needs, completing work according to specific requirements that had been discussed with living blacksmiths, but never written down or recorded in ways that invisible craftsmen could have accessed through normal means. Reverend Thomas Shepard, whose congregation included most of craftsmen, was consulted about the supernatural reports from a religious perspective. His investigation convinced him that the phenomena were genuine, though he struggled to determine whether they represented divine assistance, demonic intervention, or forces beyond theological understanding. Reverend Shepherd's interpretation suggested that the challenges of frontier life had created spiritual conditions where divine providence manifested as practical assistance for craftsmen, whose work was essential to colonial survival. He proposed that God was providing supernatural help to blacksmiths, whose skills supported entire communities. But the colonial blacksmiths had their own explanations rooted in craft traditions, guild knowledge, and the understanding that connected practitioners to forces that transcended normal human capabilities. They believed that master craftsmen who had died continued to work in spiritual forges, helping living blacksmiths achieve results beyond individual abilities. The supernatural assistance continued for several months, gradually becoming more systematic and organized. Blacksmiths reported encountering ghostly figures who worked at invisible forges, who understood metalworking techniques better than living craftsmen, and who completed projects with efficiency that suggested otherworldly knowledge of forge work. Some craftsmen claimed to recognize the spectral workers as deceased masters who had taught them during apprenticeships, former colleagues who had died but returned to continue practicing the craft they had devoted their lives to mastering. These encounters were described as inspiring rather than frightening, suggesting that the supernatural intervention was motivated by professional dedication rather than malevolent intent. The mysterious help seemed to fade as colonial blacksmiths developed greater skill and confidence in their abilities, as if the ghostly assistance had been temporary support during a period when living craftsmen needed help achieving standards that frontier conditions made difficult to maintain through normal means. Community leaders documented the period carefully, noting that metalwork quality during the months of supernatural activity had exceeded all previous standards, that tool durability had improved significantly, and that customer satisfaction had reached levels that were never again achieved through purely human craftsmanship. The blacksmiths who experienced the phantom assistance never forgot the period when invisible colleagues had helped them master techniques that seemed beyond human capability, had demonstrated methods that improved their efficiency and quality, and had shown that metalworking connected practitioners to traditions that transcended individual skill. The phenomena became part of craft folklore, stories passed down through generations of blacksmiths who found in them both comfort and explanation for their ability to achieve results that seemed to exceed the limitations of available tools, materials, and techniques. Modern researchers have proposed various explanations for the colonial blacksmithing mysteries: collective improvement in techniques shared among craftsmen, better materials becoming available through improved trade, connections, or community cooperation disguised as supernatural intervention. But the detailed records kept by colonial ministers, the testimony of credible witnesses including community leaders and customers, and the documented improvements in metalwork quality suggest that something genuinely unexplained occurred during those months when phantom blacksmiths appeared to be working alongside living craftsmen. The mystery highlighted the importance of craftsmanship in colonial survival, the spiritual dimensions that craftsmen found in their work, and the power of professional tradition to create experiences that transcended normal understanding of what individual skill could accomplish. While Ezra Whitmore worked at his forge in Medfield, a completely different world existed in the elegant mansions of Boston merchants, where colonial wealth supported lifestyles of unprecedented luxury built on trade profits that flowed from the labor of craftsmen, farmers, and workers throughout New England. Merchant Samuel Hancock owned ships that carried goods between American colonies and European markets, warehouses that stored products from throughout the Atlantic world, and counting houses where clerks recorded transactions that generated profits, supporting one of the wealthiest families in Massachusetts. Hancock woke each morning in chambers, furnished with goods imported from London, Paris, and Amsterdam, surrounded by luxury that represented the concentrated profits from dozens of trading ventures that connected colonial raw materials with European manufactured goods. His morning routine included being dressed by servants in clothing made from fabrics that had traveled thousands of miles to reach Boston. The contrast between Hancock's lifestyle and Ezra's existence was so extreme that they seemed to inhabit different worlds rather than the same colonial society. The merchant consumed in a single breakfast what blacksmiths spent on food for entire families, wasted casually what craftsmen desperately needed, and enjoyed luxuries that represented years of skilled labor. Hancock's daily routine was structured around commercial activities that generated wealth without producing physical goods, reviewing cargo manifests, negotiating prices with ships' captains, and managing correspondence with trading partners throughout the Atlantic world who connected colonial commerce with global markets. His mansion on Beacon Hill was filled with objects that demonstrated wealth and taste. Furniture crafted by master carpenters, silver made by the finest smiths, and decorative arts that represented the highest levels of craftsmanship available to colonial buyers willing to pay. Premium prices. When Hancock required metalwork for his commercial activities or household needs, he could afford to hire the most skilled blacksmiths, pay premium prices for highest quality work, and commission specialized projects that ordinary colonists could never afford. The merchant's understanding of blacksmithing was purely commercial, based on his need for ship hardware, warehouse equipment, and household items, rather than any appreciation for the skill required to transform iron into finished products. He saw metalwork as merchandise rather than craftsmanship, valued efficiency over artistry, and measured success by profit margins rather than technical excellence. Hancock's wealth allowed him to import manufactured goods from Europe, reducing his dependence on colonial craftsmen while contributing to economic pressures that made local blacksmithing less profitable and more difficult to sustain as a viable livelihood. When Hancock died at the age of 62, his death was mourned by the merchant community that shared his commercial interests and social position, but barely noticed by craftsmen whose work had supported his lifestyle. while receiving minimal compensation for their essential contributions to colonial economic development. The contrast between Hancock's luxury and Ezra's labor represented the fundamental structure of colonial society, where commercial profits concentrated wealth in the hands of merchants who contributed little to actual production, while craftsmen who created essential goods struggled to maintain modest living standards. Both men lived in the same Massachusetts colony, were subject to the same laws and social institutions, and depended ultimately on the same economic system. But they experienced completely different realities based on their positions in commercial hierarchies that rewarded trade over production and concentrated benefits among those who controlled commerce rather than those who performed essential work. By 1700, colonial blacksmithing had developed into a stable craft that served growing populations, supported expanding agricultural activities, and provided essential services that made frontier life sustainable for families and communities throughout New England and other colonial regions. Ezra Whitmore, now in his 50s and recognized as one of the most skilled blacksmiths in Massachusetts, had helped establish professional standards, training methods, and business practices that allowed colonial metalworking to achieve levels of quality and efficiency that met community needs while providing adequate livelihoods for craftsmen and their families. The blacksmithing trade had attracted enough practitioners to create informal networks that shared information about techniques, materials, and business methods, improving overall standards while maintaining the individual excellence that characterized the best colonial craftsmen. These networks operated through apprenticeship connections, regional gatherings, and the travel that brought blacksmiths into contact with colleagues whose different approaches and specialized knowledge contributed to the gradual improvement of metalworking throughout the colonial period. Children of blacksmiths learned the trade through family connections that ensured continuity of skills and knowledge, while talented apprentices from other backgrounds contributed new perspectives and innovations that prevented craft traditions from becoming rigid or outdated. The success of colonial blacksmithing demonstrated that skilled craftsmanship could flourish in frontier conditions, that European techniques could be adapted to American materials and needs, and that individual excellence could contribute to community development while providing personal satisfaction and economic security. And so we leave the blacksmith shops of colonial America, where forge fires glowed like earthbound stars, where hammer blows marked time in rhythms older than civilization, where iron and steel were transformed through skill, sweat, and the patient devotion that creates useful beauty from raw materials. These dedicated colonial blacksmiths lived lives of extraordinary purpose, rising before dawn to coax fire back to life, working until exhaustion claimed them, serving community needs that connected their individual skills to the survival and prosperity of entire settlements scattered throughout the American wilderness. Ezra Whitmore and countless others like them devoted their lives to mastering fire, bend iron, to creating tools that enabled colonial survival, to establishing craft traditions that would serve American communities for generations, while preserving skills that connected the New World to ancient metalworking knowledge. The forge. Fires have gone cold. The anvils stand silent, and the workshops that once rang with hammer music have been replaced by industrial facilities that mass-produce goods once created, individually by skilled craftsmen who knew every piece of work intimately. But the legacy of colonial blacksmiths lives on in every tool that serves human needs, every piece of metalwork that combines function with beauty, every craftsman who understands that useful objects require both technical skill and artistic vision to achieve excellence that serves practical needs while satisfying aesthetic desires. As you drift off to sleep tonight in your comfortable home, surrounded by metal objects that required no personal effort to obtain, remember the colonial blacksmiths in their smoky workshops, breathing air thick with coal dust and sparks, shaping iron with strength and skill that modern people can barely imagine. Their struggles are over, their forges cold, their hammers silent, but their story continues. In every piece of handcrafted metalwork that values quality over quantity, every craftsman who chooses skill over speed, every object created with the understanding that useful things deserve to be made well. The colonial blacksmiths knew something that our mass production world often forgets: that creating useful objects is both practical necessity and artistic expression, that working with fire and iron connects craftsmen to forces larger than individual skill, that the rhythm of hammer on anvil creates a kind of meditation that transforms both metal and maker. Ezra Whitmore spent 68 years breathing forge smoke and shaping iron so that colonial communities could survive in wilderness that offered no manufactured goods, no replacement parts, no backup systems, except what skilled craftsmen could create from raw materials and human knowledge. His legacy was not wealth or fame, but tools that served their users faithfully, techniques that were passed to apprentices who carried them forward, and the simple knowledge that individual excellence could serve community needs while providing personal satisfaction that comes from work done well. Sleep well, knowing that your tools are mass-produced rather than hand-forged, that your hardware comes from factories rather than individual workshops, that your metal objects require no personal relationship with their makers. The colonial blacksmiths earned these conveniences for us through their skill, their dedication, and their faith that individual craftsmanship could serve purposes larger than personal success. Their fire and iron have cooled, their workshops have fallen silent, their names are remembered only in family stories passed down through generations. But somewhere, in craft shops and artisan studios around the world, their tradition continues, carried on by people who understand that someone must work with fire and metal. Someone must transform raw materials into useful objects. Someone must maintain the ancient dialogue between human skill and natural forces. The rhythm of their hammers echoes still in every piece of metalwork that values quality over quantity, every tool made to last rather than to be replaced, every object created with the understanding that useful things deserve the attention, skill, and care that transform mere function into lasting beauty. Good night,